Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot Daf Pebet. We got started from the Mishnah yesterday, and today we're going to actually have the background to that Mishnah, which is this concept that if you have a sacrifice, which you're obligated to bring, and that's where the Mishnah brought the example of Harei Alai Todah. I took upon myself achrayut, responsibility, I have to bring a Todah. Then you cannot bring it from Maaser Sheni. Okay, unless you specified before that you're going to bring it, Harei Alai, I'm going to bring a Maaser from the Maaser. You're going to bring your Todah from Maaser, money, then you can do it. Then the Mishnah said, but when you can do it, okay, now I didn't really specify this yesterday, but really there's two ways in which you can do it from the Maaser. One is where you say, I'm bringing it and the bread from the Maaser, the animal and the bread from the Maaser, or, right, where you said from the beginning, Harei Alai, I'm taking it upon myself to bring from the Maaser. And I'll bring an obligation, I'm going to make this an obligation for me, but only under the condition that I bring it from Maaser. Or if it's not an obligation, just any Korban Todah. This is what we talked about. Maaser Sheni, what is it? I take my fruits, a tenth of my stuff. I either can bring it to Jerusalem to eat, or I can redeem it onto a coin, bring the money, buy with it. I can either buy meat for sacrifices. I can buy fruit, produce, anything I want. So I can buy, right? If I just decide when I'm in Jerusalem, I want to buy animals and wheat, and I want to make a Korban Todah from it, that I can do. Okay? But what I can't do is I can't say Harei Alai, make it an obligation, and then use Maaser, unless I specify from the beginning. So now we had when you can bring from Maaser, and this is why I wanted to say so, because this last line of the Mishnah that says Yavi lo yavi michitei Maaser Sheni ela mimo Maaser Sheni, you can't use grains of Maaser Sheni that I brought from home. You can only bring money and buy it with your Maaser Sheni money. You can buy grains for this korban. Is either one of those two cases when I can bring it from the Maaser, either because it wasn't a davar shebechovah, it wasn't an obligation I took upon myself, or because when I took upon the obligation, I said I'm doing it with Maaser. So now we had a machloket, Rav Nachman and Rav Chisda, and Rabbi Yirmiyah on one side versus Rabbi Zera on the other side. When it says money from Maaser Sheni, and what I can't do is I can't bring it from my house. What if I was in Jerusalem, I bought grains, and now with my Maaser Sheni money, and now I want to use them for this Korban Todah. Am I allowed to do that? Is that what the Mishnah is saying I can't do or not? So these three rabbis thought, both Rav Nachman and Rav Chisda first said, then Rabbi Yirmiyah in Israel, he was having a conversation with Rabbi Zera about it. Rav Nachman and Rav Chisda were in Babylonia. Anyway, they all three say that as long as it's not the stuff you're bringing from home, right, that it itself was originally sanctified, but it's something you bought from the Maaser Sheni money in Jerusalem, you can totally use it. Rabbi Zera said, no, you can't. You can only take money and buy with it grains to be used for it. But if you already bought your grains and now you want to say, oh, I want to use them, that doesn't work. So now Rabbi Zera said at the bottom of Pei Aleph Hamabet, I'm going to give you my reason, and I'm going to give you the reason for your theory, Rabbi Yirmiyah, why you think it's okay, and then Amatama Didach, and then I'm going to say my own reason. So he says, Amatama Didi, I'm going to give you my reason, and Amatama Didach, I'm going to give your reason. So he starts off with the reason for Rabbi Yirmiyah. And you're going to see they're very similar with one minor difference, which makes all the difference. Amatama Didach, I'll explain your reasoning. Todah mehecha kayalafla, where do you learn the Todah from? Mishlamim. You learned the fact that you can go buy stuff in Jerusalem with your Maaser Sheni money for a Korban Todah, in the cases when you can, and in a case, let's say, where it's optional, that you took upon an obligation, Harei Alai, you learn that from Shlamim. And Shlamim, where do you learn Shlamim from? How do you know? It's just like you can go into Jerusalem and buy your Shlamim, you can also buy your stuff for a Todah with your Maaser Sheni money. How do we know you can buy Shlamim? Well, Sham Maaser. It says about the Shlamim, you should bring your Shlamim ba'achal tasham and eat them there in Jerusalem. And it also says your Maaser Sheni, you should achal tasham, same thing. So we're going to learn that since Maaser Sheni is eaten there and Shlamim is eaten there, well, you can buy your Shlamim you can use your Maaser Sheni money to buy the Shlamim. Umina. Well, if we're learning it from Maaser, we're going to learn it completely from Maaser, from Shlamim. If we learn Todah from Shlamim, and Shlamim is learned from Maaser, we're going to learn that what's true for the Todah is going to be learned from Shlamim. Ma Shlamim ein gufa Maaser, af Todah nami ein gufa Maaser. just like shlamim, they're not they're not actually, you can't, okay, let me say it very simply. You can't have an animal that's Maser Sheni that comes from your house, because Maser Sheni is only on your produce, not on your animals. So ein gufan maaser. When you go buy the shlamim, it's not from, you don't take an animal that you brought from home as your maaser. You take your money and you go buy something from it. So likewise, you can't bring from your house your maaser and use it for your bread, right? In the case of the toda, you could theoretically have chitim that were actually maaser sheni. But since it's all learned from shlamim, and shlamim can't be that glad, it can't be used from the actual maaser sheni, so therefore you can use it with the money of the maaser sheni. Now, hanichite halikuchot b'ma'ot maaser sheni nami ein gufan maaser. Now, if you have grains that you bought in Jerusalem, they're not gufan masir. They're not actual masir. What are they? Well, you took the sanctity from the original produce. You moved it onto the money. From the money, you then went and bought grains. The sanctity moved onto the masir, onto the grains now. So they have status of masir sheni, but they're not actually masir sheni. They're bought from the money that was redeemed from the actual produce. So therefore, that fits. That works just like the shlamim ein gufan masir. These aren't gufan masir, and therefore they can be used. But now he says, now I'm going to say my reason. So same, he starts off the same way. We learn the Todah Mishlamim. Shlamim, Sham Shami Maser. We learned it out from Maser. Mashlamim. Now, how are we going to learn it? We're going to learn it the same way, but what he's going to define Shlamim differently. Mashlamim ein min Maser. They're not a type that could be used for Maser at all, because they're from animals as opposed to grains. Af toda ein min maaser. So you can't use a toda. You can't use for your toda anything that is a type that could be maaser. Not that it actually is maaser, but that it's a type that could be, like grains. So you can't just take grains and say, oh, I bought these already with maaser sheni money, I'm going to use them for my toda. Right? La fuke, that comes to exclude chitim alekucha maaser sheni to be maaser ninu. Right? If you buy grains in Jerusalem from your maaser sheni money, now these could have been a type that you could have brought from home, and therefore they're excluded from the salacha, and you cannot use them. Again, the only thing you're allowed to do is take your money and say, now I'm going to buy grains in Jerusalem to use for my toda. But if you already bought the grains and say, I want to use these now for my toda, you can't do that, according to Rabbi Zera. I'm a Rabbi Yomi. So they did the exact same thing. They learned it exactly from shlamim, but what exactly about shlamim? En gufan maaser, they're not inherently maaser, or their type can't be maaser. I'm Rabbi Ami. Now comes the second topic of today. So the first topic was this machloket about grains that you already bought with maaser sheni money. Can you use them for your toda or not? Second topic is Rabbi Ami says, hamatpis ma'ol maaser sheni l'shlamim lo kanu shlamim. We have to explain a lot of terms here. Matpis means I say I'm going to take my money for maaser sheni. Let's say I'm on my way to Jerusalem. I say I'm going to use these to buy a korban shlamim. Now, normally, what that would mean is if I take money and I say I'm designating this for a korban, it's sanctified for the korban. It has what we call kedushat damim. You can only take that money now and buy shlamim with it. Comes Rabbi Ami and he says, lo kanu shlamim. This didn't do anything. Why didn't it do anything? My time. Well, what's the reason? Because the kedusha of the shlamim is not strong enough. This is a very interesting concept, to overcome the kedusha that's already on this money of the maaser sheni. This money has sanctity already. Now, if I was doing something kedusha aguf, turning it into an animal that, I'm going to say this is going to the temple on the altar, I could maybe do that. But this is already got sanctity of maaser sheni sanctity, and kedushat damim is not such a high level sanctity. It's not strong enough to basically be put on top of the shlamim, the maaser sheni. I'm sorry. So the sanctity of the shlamim isn't strong enough. It's just its value, right? We're just saying the money's going. We don't say this is going on the altar. The money's going to buy an animal. The money's already designated as maaser sheni money, so you can't add any more sanctity to it. Metivei. Now we're going to have a difficulty from a Mishnah. Now the Mishnah before this one says that basically what you're supposed to do when you go to Jerusalem is you're supposed to buy either, right, produce. You could buy animals, but if you're buying animals, we want you to bring those animals on the altar. They didn't want to deplete the number of animals that were basically in Jerusalem, that if people wanted sacrifices, they should be able to use them. So they encourage people to take animals if they were going to buy animals with Maser Sheni money, they wanted them to sacrifice them. So generally, the animals were for sacrificing. If you had chayot, which are undomesticated animals, which don't go on the altar, so like a deer and things like that. So if you bought one of those for a shlamim, okay, yeah, those generally you could buy to eat in Jerusalem with your Maser Sheni money. But now what would generally happen is if you bought those, we're going to learn that yatsa ha'or lechulin. The hide becomes chulin because if you're buying, let's say, an animal for a sacrifice, so what normally happens is it's supposed to be offered as a sacrifice. Now, shlamim, this is meant to be eaten. Now, your maser sheni money, so it goes to buy an animal. The problem is the hide doesn't get eaten. So basically, the chulin, the hide, which isn't meant to be eaten, actually just becomes chulin. The sanctity of the maser sheni is removed from it. But this Mishnah says, if you buy a chaya, which can't go on the altar, but you buy it for zivchei shlamim, you buy it for a korban, which is weird because it doesn't go on the altar. What would mean then? It would mean that its value is going to now buy a korban. So let's say you took an animal, you said, you buy an animal with your maser sheni money for a korban, but it's undomesticated, so you can't use it. So if the animal's worth $100, you're going to take $100 now, sell this animal, go buy an animal that can go on the altar with $100. And now you're not really supposed to do that. But if you did it, or you say, I'm buying an animal to just eat for the sake of eating, which you're not allowed to do because the rabbi said, we want you to buy your animals with maser sheni money to go on the altar. Right? It's shlamim, voluntary offerings. Lo yatsa or lechulin. Now, in both those cases, the hide doesn't become chulin. It stays with the sanctity of maser sheni. Why is this? Well, for the case of the chayal zivchei shlamim, and this is what's going to create the problem, it must be, why doesn't it go to chulin? Because if the whole animal, including the hide, is worth $100, what you basically said is, I'm giving the value of this animal, the complete animal, including the hide, to the temple, meaning I want to now sell it, take the whole $100 and go buy a new animal that's going to go on the altar. Now, it's true the hide of that other animal won't go on the altar. But right now, this animal, you're just doing its value. Okay, what do you see here? If you say you're taking money you're basically transferring, you're putting, well, we'll talk about in a minute what the problem is. I want to wait till see it in the Gemara. The behema basar tava, if you buy an animal for basar tava, the reason why we're not going to let the or go as chulin is because we didn't want you to do that in the first place. It was supposed to be all for sacrifices, and they penalized you basically. So now they're going to say, lav lameimra dekane shlamim. Now, what do you see here? If I bought this animal with maser sheni, what does it mean? It means the animal now has maser sheni sanctity to it. Now, if we say that the shlamim sanctity can go on top of the maser sheni sanctity, then we could say this also has sanctity of shlamim, and that's why the or doesn't go lechulin, because like I said, this now is kedushat damim of a shlamim. You have to sell it and give it to the temple, right? Go buy an animal that can go on the altar. And that goes against what we said. Because once it's maser sheni, it shouldn't be able to have sanctity of shlamim. That shouldn't be enough to give it sanctity of its value, shouldn't be sanctified for the shlamim. Only the maser sheni part. So they say, no, you misunderstood the case entirely. Okay, not entirely, but you misunderstood why yatzaha or lechulin in that case. Ha'id marla, wasn't it said about that? Amarav, lo kani shlamim. Okay, so first of all, it can't possibly be that it has the sanctity of a shlamim. So everything I told you, which is when you buy this chaya for a shlamim, it's going to be treated like a shlamim. You're going to have to sell the animal and buy a shlamim with it. Completely not true. Umay lo yatzaha or lechulin. Well, it's completely not true. Then what does it mean? Lo yatzaha or lechulin. To which they say, Hachi kamar. Eino b'torah latzeta or lechulin. My taima, amarabba naaseh kelokach shor lecharisha. Okay, we'll get to that in a minute. But what they're basically saying is, you did nothing. You did absolutely nothing. This action has no bearing, which actually fits with what Rabbi Yanni said. If you take money and say, maser sheni money, I'm going to buy an animal with it. In this case, you actually bought an animal with it, but it wasn't an animal. If you actually bought an animal that could go on the altar, it would go on the altar. And then what would happen? The hide would become chulin. Because remember, that's what we said in the basic case. But since it's a non-domesticated animal, and you can't put it on the altar, you actually did nothing. Because the only thing you'd be able to do, remember, if it's kedushat aguf, if it's an animal that could go on the altar, so the kedushat aguf can be stronger, and that's much more inherent sanctity than the kedusha of maser sheni. So that would work. But if you're taking an animal this undomesticated that can't go on the altar, then all you're doing is damim. Kedushat damim is not strong enough. And then what it's telling you is, well, the halacha that if it were an animal, it would go the chulin because it would actually be a shlamim, and then it's only the parts you can eat, and the ore is going to become chulin. That's only when it's actually working. When it's not working at all, when you've done nothing, well, then the ore obviously is going to go chulin because you've done nothing. It doesn't, there's no kedusha to any part of the animal, right? It's got the sanctity of Maser Sheni, and that's why the ore is not chulin, because the whole thing's Maser Sheni, but it doesn't have any sanctity of a korban because you did a totally ineffectual act. Okay, it has no effect on anything. Okay, now why does this have no effect really? Now the Rabbi explains. Because what are you allowed to do? You're allowed to basically buy food, animals, right? All that stuff that you can bring as a shlamim, right? You're not allowed to buy animal sacrifices that get burned on the altar. You're allowed to buy animal sacrifices that you can eat because Maser Sheni is meant for you to eat it in Jerusalem. Well, what if I buy an ox for plowing with my Maser Sheni money? I can't do that. And not only can I not do it, but it has no effect. And what does it mean it has no effect? It means if I take my Maser Sheni money and I buy something with it, what normally happens is the sanctity moves from the money onto the object. In this case, the sanctity stays on the money. And I basically did nothing. And as I didn't remove the Maser Sheni because there was nowhere for it to go. Because you can't move Maser Sheni onto something that's not relevant for it. So what's not relevant? A shore for plowing is not relevant. And an undomesticated animal for a korban is not a relevant act. Because again, that goes perfectly now with what Rabbi Yomi said. If you say you designate money for Maser Sheni, for a korban, nothing happens. Again, it happens if you actually buy it, but only if you buy an animal that could go on the altar. This animal couldn't, so nothing happened. Itmar. Now we're going to see, though, there's a machloket about this topic. Hamat pismo Maser Sheni l'shlamim. What Rabbi Ami said. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Kani. He says it actually works. Your money has sanctity to it. Kedushat damim. Its value is sanctified. Rabbi Elazar Amar Lo Kani. So he says just like Rabbi Ami, but Rabbi Yochanan has this different opinion. So now we're going to explain the machloket. Aliba de Rabbi Yehuda Damar Maser Mamon Hedyotu. It's machloket Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Meir. Is Maser Sheni? Is it basically my own money? Just I have to bring it and eat it in Jerusalem? Or is it really sanctified? Like Mamon Gavor, we're going to call it, like God's money, and I just, I bring it to Jerusalem and I'm allowed to eat from it, but it really belongs to God. So you're going to see why this is relevant. So Aliba de Rabbi Yehuda, if you say like Rabbi Yehuda, the Maaser is Mamon Hedyot, then it doesn't have any sanctity to it. Well then, let's go back to our sugya. Everyone would agree that it's koneh. I'd say I'm putting this money, right, and I'm going to buy an animal with it. It's like taking any unsanctified money and saying I'm buying an animal, the sanctity code. Remember, the whole problem was if it's already sanctified, Maser Sheni, you can't bring this other sanctity that's kind of the same level. It won't overpower it. But if it's got no sanctity to it, then of course you say I'm bringing it as a sacrifice. It'll work. But they disagree within Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir said Maaser is really belonging to God. It is sanctified. So Mandamar lo kani Rabbi Meir. If you hold right, you say it's not koneh, like Rabbi Ami that we saw before, and Rabbi Elazar who now said it. So you hold like Rabbi Meir. Basically, simply, this has kedusha. You can't add any more kedusha to it. It's not strong enough. The kedusha of the value. Umandamar kane, which is Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yochanan can say, Kevan de Maaser should be karev le shlamim. Since Maaser can be sacrificed as a shlamim, ki mitfas leinami tafis. Well, since Maaser Sheni money, one of its possible designations, the route you could take with it is to buy shlamim. So then we basically say then, if you designate it for shlamim, then since it's anyway, that's a possible route for it, then the sanctity kicks in. Now we're going to ask a difficulty, Meitive, on Rabbi Elazar. Meitive, Hamat Pismo, Maaser Sheni l'shlamim, Kashu Podan, Mosifas Alehem Shnei Chumshin, Chad lehekdesh, Chad lemaser. When you redeem things, like you take your Maaser Sheni money and you put it on shlamim, you say this is going to go for korban shlamim. So when you redeem it now and buy the korban shlamim, you have to add 2 extra fifths. Okay, normally you have to add a fifth when you redeem your Maaser Sheni produce into money. Okay, you take a little bit more than the money. Okay, a fifth. Here you have to take 2 fifths, one for hekdesh and one for Maaser, because it's got 2 sanctities to it. What do you see here? The sanctity of the kedushat damim is there. Right? So they say, don't worry about that source. That source isn't, according to everybody. That source, Hamani Rabbi Yehuda, you could just simply say that source is Rabbi Yehuda, who says it's Mamon Hedyot. It doesn't have sanctity, and that's why the sanctity of the Shlamim work. It doesn't mean Rabbi Meir is going to agree with that. So that's really not a difficulty. Okay, that ends that section. I'll just review this section instead of at the end of the daf. I'll review it now because we're going to close this topic and move on. It's a topic that relates, but it's a completely different sugya. So what we had so far was we talked about the chitim maaser sheni that were bought with the money. Can you use them for the toda or not? We said in the end it's a machloket between Rabbi Zera and Rabbi Yirmiyah, and also Rav Chisda and Rav Nachman, who hold like Rabbi Yirmiyah, who think it can be done, and Rabbi Zera says no. And basically, it bottom line, according to Rabbi Zera, anyway, they both learn it in the same way. It's all learned out from the Shlamim, which is learned out from the Maaser, Fraik, Zera, Shava. And since we learn Toda from Shlamim, it has to be like Shlamim. The question is, in what way? And therefore, would that be included or not included? Then we went to this other sugya about the different opinions about whether I take my ma'om maaser sheni, can I put sanctity on it by saying, I'm going to buy an animal with this? And we had some difficulties raised on the different opinions. And with that, we're moving on to the next Mishnah, which is really a prerequisite to understanding the previous Mishnah. Minayin la'omer harei alai toda, shelo yavi ela min hachulin. How do you know if you say harei alai toda? It's basically saying, okay, the last Mishnah, premise of the last Mishnah, what's it based on? If you say, I'm accepting upon myself as an obligation to bring a toda, how do I know that I can't bring it from maaser sheni? It has to be only from chulin. Talmud lamal, v'zavachta Pesach. Okay, Pesach today. Nice to be discussing this. You bring the korban Pesach LaHashem Elokecha tzon ubakar. It's a very weird pasuk. You don't really bring a korban Pesach tzon ubakar. You bring it from tzon, from the sheep and the goats. You don't bring it from bakar, which is cattle. Halo Pesach he'im ba ela min hakvasim u'min ha'ezim. It comes only from sheep and goats. Im ke'mata malomar tzon ubakar. It's coming to teach you a hekesh, a juxtaposition of two things. La'akish kol haba min hatzon u'min habakar lePesach. Anything that comes from the sheep or from the goats. Anything that comes from the sheep and from the cattle, meaning other sacrifices, are like a Pesach. In what way? Ma Pesach davar shebechovan. Now Pesach is an obligation, that's for sure. Right? We all have to bring the korban Pesach. Ve'eino ba'ela min hachulin. And we know that it only comes from chulin. Now, they take this as a given. The Gemara is going to have a big question, how do we know this? But we'll wait to get to that. So, since we know that Pesach can be bought from chulin, av kol davar shebechovah, so anything that's like a Pesach, which is an obligatory sacrifice, eino ba'ela min hachulin. You can only buy it from chulin. What it basically means is you can use your maaser sheni money only to buy optional korbanot, not obligatory ones. Lefichach, therefore, ha'omer harei alai toda, harei alai shlamim. If you say, I'm going to take upon myself a toda, or I'm going to take upon myself a shlamim, and you obligate yourself then, ho'il, right, from the laws of nidarim and nidavot, ho'il u'ba'in chova, lo yaviu ela min hachulin. Since they're obligatory, you have to bring them from chulin. U'nisachim b'chol makom lo yaviu ela min hachulin. Now, the libations, no matter what, you can't buy from maaser sheni, and that's for a completely different reason. That goes back to what we said about the shor l'charisha. Libations that go with sacrifices, even if, let's say, it wasn't an obligatory sacrifice, but it comes with libations. Now, the libations get poured or burned completely on the altar, which means that they're not food. Maaser sheni has to be food items that I'm going to eat in Jerusalem. So nisachim libations could never come from maaser sheni. So now the Gemara starts, and that's going to be the question the Gemara is going to take us into tomorrow. And we're going to get off on a lot because we still have a bet, okay? But the question of the Gemara is, Pesach gufei menalan. How do we know that Pesach can only come from chulin and not maaser? For this, we're going to get into a debate between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. And Rabbi Eliezer, we're going to have Rabbi Eliezer's reason for Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. We're only going to get to Rabbi Akiva's answer tomorrow. We're going to ask later on the daf, well, if Rabbi Akiva doesn't agree with Rabbi Eliezer, then where does he get it from? And they're going to start a whole long braita, which we're not going to yet get to the answer today. So we're going to have one answer today. That's basically all we're going to do, even though, like I said, we still have a whole amud left. So you'll see. Titania, as it says in a braita, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Ne'amar Pesach b'Mitzrayim, v'ne'amar Pesach l'dorot. There was Pesach that they did in Egypt, right, which was the first year as they were getting out. They sacrificed the animals. Remember, they put the blood on the doorpost. It wasn't exactly a regular sacrifice. There was no altar or anything. They didn't burn parts on the altar. They didn't put the blood on the altar. V'ne'amar Pesach l'dorot. And then there's Pesach that you do for future generations. Now, ma Pesach ha'amor b'Mitzrayim, where they buy their animals from, right? Lo ba ela min hachulin. They certainly didn't buy it from maaser sheni produce or maaser sheni money, because, okay, they weren't in Jerusalem, number one. they weren't in Israel yet to even have Maaser Sheni. Maaser Sheni only comes into play when they get into the land. So since then, the first original Pesach, there was no Maaser Sheni, you couldn't buy it. Af Pesach Hamor L'Dorot Lo Ba'al Menachulin. So all other future years could never be brought right from Maaser Sheni, only from Chulin, non-sacred produce. The obvious question, Amar lo Rabbi Akiva, V'chi danim efshar mishe'i efshar. There was no possibility of them having Maaser Sheni because they weren't in Israel. So you can't learn a case where nowadays it's possible we could maybe buy from Maaser. So how are we going to say, well, because they didn't do it then, because they couldn't do it then, we can't do it now? Maybe we could. So he doesn't like that answer. Amar lo, Rabbi Eliezer retorts, Af al pi she'i efshar, ra'aya gdola v'nomad himenu. Even though it's not possible that they could have done it with Maaser Sheni, and that's why they didn't do it, but it's a very good proof. Okay, it's not the most convincing answer, but what he's trying to say is Pesach Mitzrayim was the basis. That was the first time they did it, and we do it every year to remember what they did then. So if we couldn't, so we're basically going to do it in the same way we did it then. And I don't care EF that's not important to me, because that built the basis for how we do our Korban Pesach nowadays. So Rabbi Akiva now comes and brings a different claim. Later, the Gemara is going to try to understand what exactly was going on in these different layers, sections. But he says, but wait, how could you say that that built the paradigm for the future years? It was a completely different type of offering. You can't learn from that offering to nowadays. That offering didn't have blood on the altar, didn't have parts being burned on the altar, turning out Amud Bet. Tomar b'Pesach Dorot, but in the future generations, it's completely different. So maybe it's just like it's different. Sheta'un matan damim v'imurim l'gabei mizbeach. It needs blood and burning parts on the altar. So therefore, maybe the fact that it didn't come from Maaser then doesn't mean that it can't come from Maaser now. Amar lo, Rabbi Eliezer has the last word. He says, Harei u'omer v'avadata et havodah zot b'chodesh hazeh. Says you're supposed to do this work on this month. What do they learn from here? Every time you have to do the avodah in this month, in all subsequent years, it should be done like this. Meaning, even though maybe it was different, but we're going to learn this halacha to all future generations anyway. Okay? Later, the Gemara is going to call this a hekesh because they're basically juxtaposing all the future years in one in this pasuk, even though it's not exactly your typical juxtaposition, which is two words that are similar, they're near each other, two words that are near each other, we're going to learn the same from the other, but this is basically saying we're juxtaposing all the years together, including the first year. Okay, now the Gemara is going to ask some questions on this and kind of reread a little bit the conversation that ensued between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer. But remember, the whole reason we're here is because Rabbi Eliezer says, where do we get the Pesach can only be bought from Chulin and not Maaser Sheni? Because the first year they didn't buy it from Maaser Sheni. Again, Rabbi Akiva's big claim against him is it was impossible for them to have Maaser Sheni. Then it didn't even exist. So of course they did, but that doesn't teach you anything about now. And then he had a second claim, which is Pesach in Mitzrayim was completely different than Pesach in future generations. So how can you learn one from the other? So now they're going to question a little bit. Rabbi Akiva, if he holds you can't learn from Pesach Mitzrayim because there was no Maaser Sheni. Leiku b'milte. Why did he change his tone in the argument? Why did he start bringing in the different argument? That was his claim. That claim holds true no matter what. You can't learn Efshar Mishi Efshar. So, end of story. Well, Ihadrabe, if he changed his mind about it, Vahai de lo gamar mi Pesach Mitzrayim mishum hai pirchahu. Maybe he changed his mind about Mishi Efshar. And then the fact that he's not going to learn Pesach Mitzrayim, right? And that's his question. Maybe what caused him to bring the second stage of his argument, which is, well, it's completely different. Well, we have an answer to that because you could answer Rabbi Akiva. It's not a good question because you could say Pesach Midbar Yochiach, but in the desert they did do blood and imurim on the altar. So therefore, why don't you say we can? And they definitely didn't do it for Maaser Sheni because there was no Maaser Sheni. So if he really changed his mind and he said, well, maybe you can be Efshar Mishi Efshar, then he could have learned from the desert. And his second claim is irrelevant then because, okay, you're not going to learn from Pesach Mitzrayim. You could learn it from future generations, from the desert to future generations, where they actually did the same korban that we do nowadays. So, or that we did then. right, in the first temple period, second temple period. So, or even just, the Mishkan, okay, once they were in Israel. So theoretically, you really could have learned it from there. And then Rabbi Akiva really has no claim. So that doesn't really make sense because Rabbi Akiva does seem to have an argument, and in the end, Rabbi Eliezer answers from a different place. So something doesn't really work here. To which they say it must be that what he's saying is this. He starts off with his argument: you can't do Efshar Mishi Efshar. It's impossible that they could have done Maser Sheni, and that's why they didn't. But that doesn't teach you anything for the future. What about his second claim? Well, it's different the way they did it in the desert. I'm sorry, in Mitzrayim in Egypt than they did it later in Israel. Well, lidvarav de Rabbi Eliezer Kamar. That statement was said according to Rabbi Eliezer, meaning according to you. I don't think that danim efshar mishi efshar, but according to you, who thinks you can, lididi ain danim efshar mishi efshar. For me, I don't. Lididach amar danim efshar mishi efshar. But according to you, you can. You think you can. I still have a claim within your logic, which is Mala Pesach B'Tzrayim Shkenein Te'um Matan Damim V'imurim L'Gabei Mizbeach. Tomar B'Pesach Torot She'Te'um Matan Damim V'imurim L'Gabei Mizbeach. So I would say to you, but still, even in your theory, that you could learn something that was impossible from something that's possible from something that was impossible. But how could you learn Pesach in the future from Pesach Mitzrayim when it was so completely different? Now, Va'amar Le Rabbi Eliezer Va'avadata. That's where Rabbi Eliezer comes and brings in the Avadata pasuk. Okay, according to me, who I think you can learn from something that's that was impossible, and learn to there from when it is possible. And you're right, they're different, but there's this pasuk that says we're going to learn to do like this anyway in future generations. And from that, he gets again back to his theory. That's why I think we learn from here that if, again, this was all to teach you that just like they didn't buy the Pesach from Maser Sheni in the desert, you can't do it in the future either. Now we have a problem, though, which is, once we already started saying, well, there was a counterclaim to Rabbi Akiva's second argument, and it wasn't really v'avadata. It was a better claim, which is, okay, you want to say Pesach Mitzrayim was different, and that's why we don't learn from there, but Pesach in the desert also wasn't from the Maser, and was exactly like the later years. So Rabbi Eliezer, Pesach Midbar Yochiach, why didn't he say, I'll prove you wrong from Pesach in the desert? Well, now we're going to reread Rabbi Eliezer. He's saying, okay, they were each talking according to you. Okay, so Lidvarav de Rabbi Akiva ka'amarle. He was really talking according to Rabbi Akiva. He says, Lididi, according to me, danim efshar mishi efshar. I have no problem learning something from something that was impossible, right? We can learn now when it is possible to buy from Maser from a case when it was impossible. And the fact that they didn't do it then, they still don't do it today. Umishum hai pircha, Pesach midbar yochiach. And right, and what's the thing? I could tell you, you want to have mishum hai pircha. You have some problem with it though, but the Pesach in Mitzrayim was completely different. Now we're adding words here. I could tell you Pesach midbar yochiach. Okay, I have no problem with that claim of yours. The second claim of yours, and the first claim of yours, I disagree with. The second claim of yours, if you want to stick with your claim and then claim, well, it's different. Well, Pesach midbar shows it wasn't different because Pesach in the desert, no maaser, and yet, right? And yet, they still, right? Ladidi, danim efshar, right? Sorry. This is still according to, sorry, one second. The first part is still according to Rabbi Eliezer. He says, according to me, I think you can learn from a case where it was impossible. So I'm going to explain to you, in the desert, where they did it the exact same way, again, counterclaim to Rabbi Akiva's second argument. You say in Mitzrayim it was different, but in the desert it wasn't different. And in the desert, they didn't have maaser. Again, it was impossible for them to have had. But from there you learn to future, because again, this is all within Rabbi Eliezer. He thinks you can learn Misha Yevshar from a case when it's impossible. Now, then he continues. When he brings the Avadata, then what they're basically adding is, there was a second retort of Rabbi Eliezer to the second, there was a retort of Rabbi Eliezer to the second claim of Rabbi Akiva that wasn't the Avadata. The Avadata came after that, which was, we add this extra level. Ledidach, but according to you, who said, that you can't learn Pesach, right? You can't learn from the desert even to now, because in the desert there was no possibility for Maser Sheni. Well, I'll give you a claim to that, which is Va'avadata. That pasuk claims we can learn all the way back to Pesach in Egypt. Now, okay, and that's how we read Rabbi Eliezer. So each one had a line. Here we kind of added a line of Rabbi Eliezer, but where they were talking according to you. Now, Hashanami Lifrach. Now, why didn't Rabbi Akiva just say, yeah, but I still don't think you learn Efshar Mishi Efshar? Why is the V'yavadita such a clear-cut claim that Rabbi Akiva can't argue against? Rav Sheshet says you can conclude from here. Zot omeret, this shows you that Emeshivin Hekesh. Told you that we're going to call that pasuk a Hekesh. You can't argue against a Hekesh. Hekesh is a very strong kind of limud. This whole debate why it is exactly. Some people say it's because you can't make them up on your own. You only get it by tradition. Others say, no, that's not true. That's only true for Gzera Shava. Where'd you get that from? Anyway, there's a bit of a debate why this is, but let's just take it as a basis that you can't argue against Hekeshim, and that's why Rabbi Akiva had no argument there. That kind of won the argument. Ubit Tarbitzam, where in the Beit Midrash they asked a different question here, which is, what was this whole thing about? Where do we learn Pesach from? And the answer is from this Hekesh Avavadetam, right? And we get it from, we're going to compare Pesach Dorot to Pesach Mitzrayim to Pesach in the future. Then we said, and then where do you learn for other korbanot? Because of the words bakar and son. We're going to make, again, another juxtaposition here. Now that leads, right, which is whatever comes from the bakar is like what comes from the tzon of Pesach, and we're going to say it's the same thing you can't buy from the maaser. So they say, remember we learned this in Zvachim. You can't just take something that was learned out by juxtaposition and, and then bring another one that's learned out by juxtaposition. So to which they answer, Bichlala Itmar, Pesach Kule Chada Milti. This Avadita is not really a Hekesh. It's just saying that all Pesachim are the same. All Pesachs for all the generations, including the first one, they all have the same laws for this, and therefore that's just one general categorization. It's not a Hekesh, okay, per se. And then there's only one Hekesh. Okay, that resolves the issue. So that was all Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer's reason is, because we learn it from the Pesach that happened in Egypt, where they didn't buy it from the Maaser, so forever on, you can't learn it from the Maaser. Now they want to know, okay, Rabbi Akiva, Pesach de'eno ba menachulin, ela menachulin menale. So where does Rabbi Akiva get it from? He was very against Rabbi Eliezer's drasha, so what's his drasha? So, nafkale mehad Amar Shmuel b'shem Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, now we're going to see. Shmuel is going to say b'shem Rabbi Eliezer. Now, here we're going to have Rabbi Eliezer, and then we're going to have Rabbi Akiva. So we're completely off where we want to be at. It's going to take a while to get there, but we're going to now go through this drasha. Zot, we're going to take a pasuk from Vayikra. Zayin Lamed Zayin. If you remember, we've seen this before in Zvachim. It's the last pasuk in the section of the Korbanot, and it's or the end of the section. I can't remember if it's the exact last one, but it's definitely at the end there. Zot HaTorah Lo'olah L'mincha L'chataru L'Hasham V'Lemiluim L'Zevach HaShlamim. And it compares, basically, it makes this, again, juxtaposes all these korbanot, all these types of korbanot to each other. And first we're going to bring Rabbi Eliezer's approach, and he's going to teach us all sorts of things that we're going to learn one from the other. And then we're going to get to Rabbi Akiva, and within one of the things of Rabbi Akiva, one of these words, he's going to use to learn this halacha. Again, you can't buy Pesach from the animal for your Korban Pesach from Maaser Sheni. So, again, completely off topic now, Ola. According to Rabbi Eliezer, okay, that Shmuel quotes, Amar Shmuel Mishum Rabbi Eliezer, Ola Gufa, and we learned this all in Zvachim. Ola. What does the word Ola teach you? Ma Ola tuna kli, av kol ta'un kli. Just like Ola needs a vessel, all other sacrifices need a vessel. We're basically going to say each one teaches you something about other sacrifices as well. So, Mahi, what kind of vessel? Now, Ilema Mizrak, if you're talking about the bowl that you put the blood in, because in Matan Torah, when they brought sacrifices, it says they brought olot, and they put them in aganot, in bowls. But, also public shlamim offerings, peace offerings that were tziburi ones for the community, also it says you put in aganot, because at Matan Torah, they brought olot, and they brought shlamim. So, you can't say we're learning from Ola to all the others, because it also appears by shlamim. Elas sakin. They must be talking about the vessel you need is a knife. The Ola Gufa Minala. Now, how do you know you need a knife for a Korban Ola? They're going to learn it from an interesting place, from Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac. Dichtiv, Vayishlach Avraham Yado, Vayikach et ha'ma'achelet lishchot et beno. He takes his hand, and he picks up the knife to slaughter his son. The Hatam Olehu, and we know it was an Ola Dichtiv, Vayaleu la'olah tachat beno. He takes the ram, and he offers it in place of his son, and he offers it as an Ola, it says. So there you have Korban Ola needs a knife. From there you learn all the other sacrifices need a knife. Second and last one for today, Mincha. Ma mincha. The remainder is the remnants of the Mincha, can only be eaten by the male Kohanim. Avkol Now from here we learn to other korbanot, they're only by male kohanim. This obviously doesn't apply to all korbanot, must apply to some other korbanot. Gemara is going to ask Maihi, which ones? Well, some of them it says explicitly, like the chatat and the yasham. So we're going to continue tomorrow and figure out which one are they actually referring to here. And with that, we finish the daf. So the second part of the daf can be very easily summarized. Summarize the first already, which is we're learning this whole idea that a korban shebechovah can't be brought from Maaser Sheni, all learned out from Pesach, from the korban Pesach. Where do we learn the korban Pesach from? According to Rabbi Eliezer, we learned it from the Pesach that was in Mitzrayim, that couldn't have been brought from Maaser because there was no Maaser. And Rabbi Akiva didn't like that drasha because he says, Ein danim efshar mishe'i efshar. That was impossible to have Maaser Sheni. Now that we can, maybe we can. Okay, just because they didn't have it then is because it didn't exist. So now we're going to try to figure out what's Rabbi Akiva's source. That we finished for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and Moadim L'Simcha.